Well, this didn't turn out how I expected it to. Today's Ancient DOS game was originally going to be what you're seeing right now, simply titled PC Golf. But there's actually surprisingly little to say about it. Heck, the main reason I wanted to cover it was because it's a game we actually had way back in the late 80s on our Tandy 1000 SX computer. I don't know how it got there, but chances are it was put there along with a bunch of other software that was pre-installed by the person doing all the setup and configuration of the new system for my father. What I remember about it as a kid is that it had an interesting look, but didn't seem to play well. But then this was also very early in terms of my actually playing electronic games of any kind, so I had no idea what I was doing. Upon closer examination of this software, it turns out that really it's less game and more pure simulation. As in, you're not really trying to play this piece of software, rather instead you're using it to simulate outcomes based on your perceived level of skill and judgment. And almost as though the idea behind it is to try and teach the person playing how to be a better golfer in terms of selecting clubs and deciding how much power to put into one's swings. So since that wasn't going to fill a full video, I decided to also investigate another game, which you're seeing now, which I did not play as a child, even though this game has a very similar name and vintage to PC Golf, instead called PC Pro Golf, which I first thought was going to explain a few things about PC Golf, but the more I played it, the more I realized that two games weren't actually related. Or rather instead, PC Pro Golf feels like it was inspired by PC Golf, but otherwise made by different people. The two have a lot of similarities between them, but there's a couple things PC Pro Golf does which kind of makes it very unlikely it was made by the same person. And there's a pretty good reason why this is relevant too, which we're going to see as we get into the game stats. Let's start with the game stats for PC Golf, which as far as I can tell came out in 1985. But by who or how, those details have been lost to the stretch of time. The game has no author information, copyrights, or anything identifying its source. Even browsing through the game's executable file with a hex editor doesn't reveal anything. Now, it's possible the copy floating around online is a modified copy from a shareware distributor intentionally done to remove all traces of the author info, as this was not an unheard of practice back then. But then, because the game also has no mentions of registrations or purchasing or anything like that, I think it's more likely that it's always been anonymous. In any event, it's a one-player golf simulation running in an 80x25 text mode with only PC speaker sound effects, and as for its current release date, best I can tell, it's always been freeware, and thus a simple place to grab a copy nowadays would be the DOS Games website at www.dosgames.com. I highly doubt there are any physical copies of this game out there, at least none which aren't simply from some random shareware distributor. As for PC Pro Golf, this one's a bit more interesting and goes down a rabbit hole that's possibly a bit too deep for me to ethically research, so I only went part of the way down. From what I can tell, the game was released around 1987, give or take a year. It's hard to tell for certain, but the earliest file dates are from mid-1988 and are related to batch files made for a 2.x set of versions, whereas the version of the game I actually have is 4.3, released right at the start of 1990. Now, the game credits the author as one Jim Childress, being published by a company known as CMA Software, operating out of Virginia in the USA. Neither of these names rang any bells, let alone pulled up any relevant results when searching, but after broadening the search, I managed to locate a Jim Childress working for a larger, century-old company known as Carter Myers Automotive, CMA, who runs multiple auto shops specifically throughout the state of Virginia. That is way too coincidental, but I decided for privacy reasons not to dive any further than that. Given the newfangledness of personal computers in the 80s, I think what we're looking at here is a company which decided to try and broaden its horizons into software distribution, but then pulled back and decided to just stick with what they knew best, which in this case would be cars. The game itself primarily runs with CGA 320x200 4-color graphics, but it also switches to an 80-column text mode for displaying help details or club values. And as for audio, only supports the PC speaker for sound effects. As for its current release date, it's technically still shareware, but the game's very much not for sale anymore. And from what I understand, shareware registration simply got you an extra course, as well as a long-lost course editor for making your own courses. The shareware version itself is uncrippled and provides one full 18-hole course to play through. PC Golf starts off by giving you some basic instructions, then asks for your name, a handicap between 1 and 30, and then you select your biggest golfing difficulty. Whether you tend to hook shots to the left, slice shots to the right, don't get as much distance as you should, are bad at getting shots out of the sand, or if your putting is poor. Now, selecting any of these deficiencies will alter some of the things going on in the background. While if you select Perfect Player, you're essentially telling the game to simulate no deficiencies at all. Then you get a choice of one of 3 courses. Then tee off on the first of 18 holes with a course display, which is, pretty basic. Actually, I'm not entirely certain the logic of how it determines the length of what to show on the side, and I think it's just hard-coded separate from the actual course details, given that the length of what's shown frequently doesn't match up with the actual yardage of the course. In any event, from this point forward, it's all about picking clubs and setting your shot power. All aiming is handled automatically, with various random possibilities thrown in depending on what you're trying to do, what your handicap is, and your deficiencies. For instance, if you set your deficiency as hooking the ball, then you need to pay attention to what's going on with the left side of the fairway, as hooking the ball will cause you to land in that hazard, with the odds of a hook happening being related to how high your handicap is. If your handicap is only 1, you will rarely encounter any issues, whereas with higher numbers, you'll encounter issues considerably more often. The club selection is also kind of curious. You have 1 through 4 woods, 1 through 9 irons, and a pitching wedge, but you do not have a sand wedge, so your next best club for getting out of the sand is the pitching wedge. And when using a wood, you'll always strike with a full power swing, whereas when using an iron or the pitching wedge, you can select your shot power from 11% to 100%. Keeping in mind that it'll automatically select 100% just from typing in a 1 then a 0. This is pertinent because pressing extra keys beyond what the game expects can occasionally trip things up and make you take shots you didn't want to. Now, once you take your stroke, provided nothing funny was going on and you took a full power swing, the ball will typically get somewhere between 95% and 105% of the distance it can reach. Though if the deficiency you indicated was distance, this will be scaled back a good chunk. Plus, if you use less power in your swing, it can make a massive difference, going down to just 90% or even 95%. Though below 90%, things become much more predictable. Once you're on the green, you input a putt factor between 0.5 and 10. Now, I've found that the way it works is that every 1.0 of putt factor raises the average distance the putt will go by 5 feet, though it's a bit more complicated than that, and I wasn't able to nail down the exact math going on, especially since there is some random variance to it. And not to mention, what you visually see on screen is not indicative of actual ball position, it's just there to emphasize what's going on, rather than accurately indicate the ball state. That's all there really is to this thing. Once you clear all 18 holes for a course, you get a final score tally and are able to start again on a different course. This thing really is more of a simulation than an actual game. But it absolutely doesn't hold back with the snide humor, such as when you try to do things like swing a driver on the fairway, get only a few yards distance, and the game's like, "Where'd you learn to play golf, huh?" Which, yes, I'm aware that hitting the ball with a driver off the deck and getting proper distance out of it is technically possible, just incredibly difficult and not worth that difficulty under almost all circumstances. PC Pro Golf has a similar start to PC Golf, asking for your handicap for your name, but also indicating to input a B for beginner. I don't actually know exactly what the beginner setting does, and the manual doesn't explain it either, but my best guess is it disables the handicap feature, as the higher you set your handicap, the more likely you're going to have a bad stroke and the ball won't go where you wanted it to. You're then also able to review your club values before you begin playing, and can also review them at any time during gameplay. You actually have way more clubs in your bag than anyone would ever permit, including the 1 through 5 woods, the 1 through 9 irons, a pitching wedge, and a sand wedge. But what's more interesting than that, though, is that you're allowed to edit all of the club distance values to whatever you want. My guess here is that this is so that players can fine-tune the ball distances to match their own level of skill. As again, this quote-unquote game feels more like a simulation than a game. You're then able to select which hole to start on and which hole to end on, as you don't have to play all 18, but can instead play just a single hole or a set of holes in sequence. And when the game begins, you'll see a fairly decent bird's eye view of the hole that you're on, with the player being on deck inside a small rectangular box, and the pin is always at the center of the circular green. Now, one thing I didn't find out until later is that the reason the game is using the magenta, cyan, white CGA palette instead of the more appropriate red, green, yellow palette is only because I put the game into Tandy 1000 mode. That's literally the only thing that setting does when starting up, made more bizarre by the fact that it switches into the low intensity red, green, yellow palette once the ball is on the green, regardless of which mode the game is in. Also, those arrows are not actually arrows, they're houses. After selecting the kind of club you'd like to use, wood iron or putter, then selecting which specific club value, with the pitching wedge and sand wedge being grouped with the irons, you then select an angle and a shot power in increments of 10% up to 100%. Firstly, setting your angle is a bit odd because it's done in fairly coarse chunks using the comma and period keys, but you can switch between coarse and fine adjustments by pressing the F key. Now, as for shot power, this is entirely linear, and I mean entirely. The lie of the ball makes absolutely no difference. It can be on the fairway, in the rough, in some trees, freaking on top of the water. Doesn't matter. 100% always goes the full distance, 50% always goes half distance, etc. Yeah, that's actually one thing I find odd, is that the game really doesn't penalize the lay of the ball. I mean, you'll still get penalties if you hit the water, but for the most part, once you hit the ball, wherever it lands, and I do literally mean wherever it lands, that's where you hit it from. And where it lands seems to make no difference in how the shot goes. You can even hit a driver from the fairway and it'll go the full distance every time. Now, it is possible to get the ball into the hole from the main overhead view, but if the ball lands in the green and not in the cup, then you go to a special green view where you use your putter and have to input how many feet you want to putt. Now, unlike the main overhead view, which has absolutely no randomness applied to ball distance, this putting sequence very much applies random distance alterations to your putts. Thus, actually sinking the ball is just an exercise in pure frustration. Generally speaking, I've found that you want to aim for about 10% further than you intend the ball to go to have the greatest chance of actually making the shot. Part of the problem, though, is that the hole is the same size as the ball, so you have to be excruciatingly accurate or it's just not going in. I believe a golf cup is supposed to be a little over 2 ball widths wide at 4 1/4 inches, primarily so that there's enough space for the ball to enter the hole from any angle while the flag is also in there, sticking out of it and bending slightly in the wind. Despite being the more complex game compared to PC Golf, PC Pro Golf definitely feels the most amateur in terms of its overall design. Just as another example, while a lot of the holes in the provided Amherst course seem believable, there's a couple which totally aren't. I mean, cripes, look at this one. I'm like 99% certain there isn't a single golf course on the face of the planet which has a fairway that's just a long, straight line that's only a few yards wide and not directly in front of the deck heading towards the flag. Not to mention, this one is literally just a bridge, and the hole's too far away to get the ball across the water in one stroke. So, what are you supposed to do? Hit the ball onto the bridge? I mean, yeah, my answer was to hit it short, then smash it the rest of the way, but even if that is the intended solution, that's kind of against the whole notion of why driving the ball is even a thing in golf. Eventually, though, you reach the end of the game and are able to view your final scorecard, which is a nice touch, though it's definitely weird seeing the far less common spelling of bogey throughout this thing. I tried to figure out if there was the wrong way to spell it or not, and found out that roughly 1 in 10 golfers spell it that way. So that's a thing, apparently. Overall, both PC Golf and PC Pro Golf serve a similar purpose, as they're really not meant to be games per se, but rather instead simulations to gauge how one's own golfing skills tend to play out, and to help improve club selection and deciding how hard to hit the ball. Because, I mean, come on. These things are nowhere close to the level of quality of actual boxed golfing computer and video games up to this point in time, and it's not like there wasn't a selection. I already covered Mean 18 a while back on the show, which came out in 1986, but there were 2 other golf games of a similar level of quality released the same year or earlier. World Tour Golf by Electronic Arts and Championship Golf by both GameStar and Interplay. I guess one of these days I'll have to get around to those two so we can truly compare the quality, but as it stands, PC Golf and PC Pro Golf are interesting cornerstones in DOS gaming history, which really need more of their stories told, but weren't ever really that fun to play. Not now, and not back then either. Regardless of which game you're playing, you need to set a very low fixed cycles count, and PC Pro Golf notably runs better with the machine type set to Tandy. While for PC Golf, this really doesn't matter. Regardless of which of these two games you're setting up, I recommend a cycles count of 300 to keep things moving at an acceptable pace. Less if you want to actually see things draw in or move. Anywho, that'll be all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on March 16th will be a filler video, and I'm kind of deciding between several filler video ideas at the moment. But once I settle on one, I'll post the details up on Patreon for my high-tier supporters to see and ask questions about as usual. And regardless, make sure you stay tuned because I wouldn't be having trouble selecting a filler topic if they weren't all worth talking about. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join the ranks of everyone you see here supporting the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.